Welcome to Linguistics Tube. On this channel, you will find videos about learning English, as well as more scientific videos about linguistics and psychology, and more general academic topics such as study skills, conducting research, and writing academic articles. This episode is part of my series which explores the grammar of English. We will learn about all the major types of words, phrases, and clauses, as well as other interesting grammatical phenomena. Through these episodes, you will not only learn the theory of English grammar, but also practical tips and advice about how to improve your grammatical ability in English. In this episode, we will explore adjectives. We will cover all the main aspects of adjectives in this episode. We'll begin with a quick introduction to this type of word. Most simply, adjectives are a type of word. The more accurate way to say this is that adjectives are a grammatical category. The role or job of an adjective is to modify other grammatical categories. In the context of grammar, modify has a specific meaning. Add more detail to something. Therefore, most basically, adjectives add more detail to other types of words, and technically, adjectives modify other grammatical categories. This raises the question, which type or types of word do adjectives modify? Remember that by type of word, I mean grammatical category. Pause the video and think about this question, and continue when ready. Most simply, adjectives modify nouns. However, more accurately, adjectives modify anything that functions like a noun. That probably sounds confusing or strange, so I will show you some sentences in our first activity to explain what I mean. In the 4 sentences which you will soon see on the screen, you need to decide 2 things. Firstly, what is the adjective? And secondly, what word is it modifying? Please pause the video to complete this activity and continue when you have finished. Some of these sentences have more than one adjective or noun, so I will say modifier instead of adjective, and modified instead of noun. In the first sentence, the modifier is boring, and the word being modified is teacher. In the second sentence, the modifier is silly, and the word being modified is boring. In the third sentence, the modifier is interesting, and the word being modified is something. In the fourth sentence, the modifier is dangerous, and the phrase being modified is driving to work. From this activity, we can see 2 interesting things about adjectives. Firstly, you can see that the modifier can be in different places in relation to the word being modified. In the first and second sentences, the modifier is immediately before the word being modified. However, in the third sentence, the modifier is instead directly after the word being modified. And in the fourth sentence, the modifier is a few words after, so they are not directly connected. Regarding the second interesting thing to notice, we already learned that an adjective modifies anything that does the job of a noun. From these 4 examples, you can see that the noun can be a normal word. In this case, teacher is what we call a common noun. In the second and third sentences, the noun is a type of pronoun. A pronoun is a word that is used instead of a noun. In the second sentence, me is used instead of the speaker's name, and in the third, something is used instead of the interesting information. There are many types of pronoun. Me is a personal pronoun, whereas something is an indefinite pronoun. Regarding the fourth sentence, the adjective dangerous is modifying an entire phrase, driving to work. The technical name for this type of phrase is a gerund phrase. This entire phrase functions as a noun, because we can replace the phrase with a simple noun. For example, dogs can be dangerous. Overall, we can conclude that adjectives have many different positions in relation to the noun, and they modify different types of noun. What do adjectives do? We say they describe the properties or the features of the noun. Nouns have many different properties. You can see some of the most common ones here. For example, green book, big city, heavy suitcase, young woman, awful performance, square box, left arm. It is very common to put several adjectives together in order to describe multiple properties of the same noun. So, for example, in the sentence, I have a handsome, big, new, grey coat, all these adjectives are modifying coat. So they are giving us more information about 4 different properties of the coat. We could call handsome an opinion, big is size, new is age, and grey is colour. Together, we have a detailed understanding of the coat. In terms of punctuation, if several adjectives describe several properties of one noun, then they must be separated by commas. We'll learn more about this in section 5 of this episode. Moving to our second activity. There are 4 adjectives in this sentence. No other country can produce a book collector on quite the amazing level of Thomas Phillips, who collected the largest private library in the world. Please pause the video, find the 4 adjectives, and describe their properties. In terms of position, all of these adjectives are directly before the noun they modify. However, they all have different properties. Other is a difficult adjective to describe. Perhaps we could simply describe the property as additional information. Amazing describes the quality of the noun level. Finally, largest and private describe 2 properties of library. The first is the size, and the second is the purpose of the library, because its purpose is to only be used by Thomas Phillips. Interestingly, largest and private describe 2 properties of library, but they are not separated by a comma. We will learn why in section 5 of this episode. Let's now move to the second section, in which we will discuss a very fundamental concept in the study of grammar: form and function. The study of grammar involves many areas of a language. So, the grammar of a language can be analysed in many ways. One of the most important tasks for grammarians when analysing the grammar of a language is to decide what category every word belongs to. There are 2 methods to achieve this: the form and the function of a word. Needless to say, these are 2 fundamental concepts to the study of grammar. Specifically, they are 2 tests, or 2 ways to identify the grammatical category of a word. Throughout this video, we will mostly discuss the form of adjectives. Before I do that, I should explain exactly what form means. I'm sure you are already familiar with the general definition of this word, which is the way that something looks. The grammatical definition of form is more specific than this. when we refer to the form of a word, we refer to the word's structure. This has two aspects. Firstly, we can use form to identify the grammatical category of a word by looking at the physical shape of only that word. To demonstrate this, let's use the adjective bigger. We know that bigger might be an adjective because it is common to add er to adjectives. If we remove er and the word is still an adjective, then we can be confident that bigger is an adjective. In this case, removing er produces the adjective big. However, this aspect of form is not enough to conclusively decide that bigger is an adjective, because other grammatical categories can end with er. For example, we can add er to a verb to create a noun, which has the meaning of someone who performs that verb, such as dance, dancer, paint, painter. Because of this, we often need to use another aspect of form to identify the grammatical category of a word. This requires us to look at the bigger picture, which is how and where the word is used in the sentence. For example, if we want to identify the grammatical category of the word bigger, and we see it in the phrase a bigger house, we know that it is an adjective because adjectives are commonly positioned before nouns and commonly after articles. Articles are also called determiners. The article here is the word a, and the noun is house. So, in conclusion, after looking at the two aspects of the form of a word, we know that bigger is an adjective because it ends with a typical adjective ending, which means that big is also an adjective, and because it is after an article and before a noun. Function is the second way to identify the grammatical category of a word. The function of a word refers to the word's meaning. Therefore, in the phrase a bigger house, we know that bigger is an adjective because it gives us more detailed information about the noun phrase a house. Function can sometimes get a little complicated because sometimes a noun can function as an adjective and an adjective can function as a noun. For example, in the phrase a bigger office, bigger is an adjective which modifies office, but in the phrase a ticket office, ticket is a noun which modifies office, because it tells us more information about the type of office. Here are two examples of the opposite situation. Only the rich and famous can come here. The next few months will be difficult for the unemployed. Rich, famous, and unemployed are all adjectives, but they function here as nouns because there is no noun before or after them. As you can see, the definite article the is commonly used before an adjective functioning as a noun. So, overall, determining the grammatical category of a word is not black and white. Therefore, we need to take into account its form, which is what the word looks like, and also its function, which is what it does in the sentence. In these particular situations, we firstly state its form, and then say what its function is. So, ticket in the noun phrase a ticket office is a noun that here functions as an adjective. There are, in total, 3 positions for adjectives in an English sentence. However, one of them is very uncommon, so we can essentially say that there are 2 main positions. The positions of adjectives in relation to the noun is a way to identify the form of an adjective. Let's start by discussing the two common positions. The first common position is for adjectives to appear before the noun in a noun phrase. The term noun phrase refers to a group of words that has the job of a noun. So, the phrase a red car is a noun phrase because it has the same grammatical function as just the noun car. In this noun phrase, we know that red is an adjective because in addition to its function, which is to describe the color property of the noun, the adjective also appears before the noun, which is an aspect of the form of an adjective. Adjectives which are directly before the noun, such as good in the sentence, "This is good food," are called attributive adjectives. In the second common position, the adjective appears in the predicate. The predicate is a part of essentially every English sentence. In fact, almost all English sentences have two parts. Firstly, a subject. Secondly, a predicate. Think of the verb as the sun and everything else as the planets that move around the sun. In other words, the verb is the most important part of a sentence. The subject is everything before the verb, and the predicate is the verb and everything after the verb. In fact, we can put languages into groups based on the structure of their sentences. Because almost all English sentences have these two parts, we call English a subject-predicate language. Let's look at 3 examples of subjects and predicates to demonstrate this. Firstly, in the sentence, "James ate the apple," the verb is ate. So, James is the subject, and ate the apple is the predicate. Therefore, the predicate includes the verb ate and a noun phrase after the verb, the apple. Here is another example. In the sentence, "Janice was sleeping," the verb is was sleeping, and the subject is Janice. Therefore, the predicate is was sleeping. Finally, here is the third example. If you are chasing a criminal, you might shout, "Stop!" This is a verb, so it is the predicate in this one-word sentence. Therefore, this sentence has no subject. Returning to adjectives, they can also appear inside the predicate. In other words, they can appear after the noun, which is the subject, and after the verb. For example, in "her car is red," the subject is her car. This is the noun that the adjective modifies. The adjective, red, is after the verb is. Adjectives which are in the predicate, such as in the sentence, "This food is good," are called predicative adjectives. Just as a side note, the word predicative comes from predicate. It is not the word predictive. They are very similar, predicative, predictive, but they are definitely different words. I said at the beginning of this section that, out of the 3 positions for adjectives, one of them is very rare. These are called post-positive adjectives, and they appear immediately after the noun that they modify. It is very common for adjectives to modify nouns that are immediately before the noun, and also a few words after the noun inside the predicate. However, it is very rare in English for adjectives to modify nouns directly after the noun. There are 4 situations in which post-positive adjectives can be used. Firstly, they are used when the noun being modified is an indefinite pronoun. For example, "I bought something red." "I did nothing interesting." "I met somebody nice." Interestingly, you can sometimes put the adjective in the attributive position and add the indefinite article a or an. For example, I bought a red something. However, this definitely sounds less natural than the post-positive version. Secondly, you might be able to think of a few phrases in which the adjective is directly after a common noun, not an indefinite pronoun. If so, you are correct, because in a few unusual idiomatic phrases, the adjective can be directly after a normal noun. For example, after a presidential election in which a new president is elected, he or she is referred to as the president-elect until he or she officially becomes the president. This is definitely idiomatic because the adjective should be elected, not elect. As an attributive adjective, it sounds more normal, the elected president. Finally, here is another example. In the phrase consulate general, you can see the adjective is directly after the noun consulate. Really, this is a general consulate, but in the idiomatic phrase, the adjective is post-positive. Thirdly, post-positive adjectives can be used when there is an attributive adjective before the noun, and that attributive adjective is in the superlative form. If an adjective is in its superlative form, the adjective shows the highest amount or level of something. Superlative adjectives usually end with est. We will learn about these in section 4. For this use of post-positive adjectives, like with the indefinite pronouns, you could move the post-positive adjective before the noun. For example, instead of the shortest route possible, you could say the shortest possible route. However, again, the post-positive version sounds more natural. Finally, post-positive adjectives are sometimes used in the names of food. It is generally assumed that this happens to make the dishes seem higher class and higher quality. Here are two examples. Eggs Benedict, beef Wellington. For the second example, changing the adjective position to attributive actually changes the meaning of the noun phrase. Whereas beef Wellington is the name of a pie from England, Wellington beef means beef that comes from the city of Wellington. So, you must think carefully about the position of the adjective. Some post-positive adjectives can be attributive without changing the meaning of the noun phrase, whereas others cannot. Overall, despite these 4 situations in which post-positive adjectives are used, remember that this position is rare. If you are not sure where to put the adjective, then always put it before the noun. Regarding the 2 common adjective positions, almost all adjectives can be both attributive and predicative. However, a very small number of adjectives can only appear in the attributive position, and a very small number of adjectives can only appear in the predicative position. Here are a few examples to demonstrate this. Firstly, main. This can only be attributive because we can definitely say the main road, but not the road is main. As a side note, do you see the little star, called an asterisk, at the beginning of the road is main? In this context, it means that the sentence is ungrammatical. Here is a specific example. In the UK, the highways are called motorways, and they are given numbers. The M1 was the first to be built, and it is very close to where I was born and grew up. So, I can definitely say that the M1 is a main road, but I definitely cannot say, I live near the M1, which is main. Thus, main cannot be predicative. Another example is total. You cannot use it predicatively because you can't say, this rubbish is total, but you can say this is total rubbish. Therefore, it is only an attributive adjective. Next, here are some adjectives with the opposite situation. You can say this child is asleep, but you can't say this is an asleep child. Also, you can say she is unwell, but not she is an unwell person. Therefore, asleep and unwell are only predicative, not attributive. There are a few more examples of both situations. Try to think of some more adjectives which are either only attributive or only predicative. You might be wondering why some are only attributive and some are only predicative, and whether there is a rule or explanation for it. There isn't a foolproof method, but there is a general meaning difference between the two positions. If you encounter one of the few adjectives that cannot be in both positions, then this general meaning difference might be able to explain why the adjective is either attributive or predicative. Generally, if that adjective is only predicative and not attributive, it is because the situation it describes is temporary. Secondly, if you encounter an adjective that is only attributive, it is because the state it describes is permanent. That probably sounds confusing, so let's return to our examples. You cannot say the M1 is main, but you can say the M1 is a main road, because this motorway is always a main road. As a result, main is a permanent quality of motorway, so it must be used attributively. On the other hand, it sounds strange to say this is an asleep child, because the child will probably wake up soon. Therefore, sleep can only be used in the predicative position, because it describes a temporary aspect of the child. To be clear, this meaning difference is only relevant for the small number of adjectives that can only be in one of the two positions. Thus, you can ignore this general meaning difference for the vast majority of adjectives, which can appear in both positions. Thus, for example, the adjective dead can be both attributive and predicative. So even though death is a permanent situation, the general meaning difference doesn't apply to this word. Interestingly, for a few adjectives, changing the position of the adjective from attributive to predicative changes the meaning of the adjective. Here are two examples for you to think about. Let's start with the easy one. My old friend versus my friend is old. What are the different meanings of these two positions? Please pause the video to work out the different meanings, and continue when you are ready. If I say my old friend, it means I have known him or her for a long time. But if I say my friend is old, I am referring to the age of my friend, which is old. Here is another example. My late husband versus my husband is late. Again, please pause the video now. Let's start with the predicative position. My husband is late means he is not here yet. This is the common meaning of late. However, if you use it attributively, my late husband actually means he is dead. This meaning of late can only be used with relatives, close friends, or famous people. You cannot say my late pet dog or my late boss, for example. Jokes in English are commonly based on something having two meanings. A classic joke is about a man who is growing a beard. He might say, "At the beginning, I didn't like it, but now it is growing on me. The joke here is because of growing on me. It literally means his beard is getting longer, but it can also mean that you like something more and more every day. Because this is how many English jokes work, it is common for comedy movies and TV shows to make jokes based on someone misinterpreting the meaning of the adjective. This is a common conversation. I came to this party on my own, but my late husband would enjoy it. Well, hopefully he will arrive soon, so he can enjoy it too. Remember, I said that we can identify an adjective by looking at the physical shape of the adjective. The most obvious way to do this is to look at the ending of the adjective. Many adjectives are made by adding an ending to another word, and there are many different endings for adjectives. In Activity 3, here are common endings for adjectives. Think of at least one adjective with each ending. Please pause the video while you do this, and then continue when ready. Here are a few examples for each ending. Able, drinkable. Ul, brutal. Un, broken. Ease, Chinese. Full, forgetful. Iraqi. Ick, classic. Ish, British. Iv, attractive. Ian, Canadian. Lus, homeless. Lee, daily. Us, cautious. Cloudy. Before we continue, remember that I said that many adjectives are made by adding an ending to another word. These words are always either nouns or verbs. For example, the verb to attract becomes attractive, and the verb to care becomes careless. The noun danger becomes dangerous, and beauty becomes beautiful. I have one more task for you. Think of two more adjectives, one which is made from a verb, and another which is made from a noun. Please pause the video while you do this, and then continue when ready. For example, forgetful comes from the verb to forget, and brutal comes from the noun brute. A brute is a horrible, cruel, evil person. In the next section, we will discuss two common features of the form of adjectives, gradability and comparison. We will start with gradability. Almost all adjectives are gradable. This means that we can describe the level or amount of an adjective. To do this, we use a type of adverb called a degree adverb, which we put before the adjective. Here are a few examples, which I have arranged from the smallest amount to the biggest amount. Slightly dark, quite dark, rather dark, fairly dark, pretty dark, very dark, so dark, incredibly dark, extremely dark, completely dark. Regarding pretty, you probably noticed that it is usually an adjective. We say, she is pretty. But in this case, it is an adverb. If you want to, you could say, she is pretty, which means that she is fairly beautiful. But you will probably confuse the listener. Let's move on to another feature of adjectives, comparison. Many adjectives have three forms: the basic form, the comparative form, and the superlative form. A comparative adjective makes a comparison with something else by stating that something is more of that adjective than something else. And a superlative adjective makes a comparison with something else by stating that something is the most of something, or in other words, the highest amount or level of something. To create the two forms of comparison, two endings can be added to the adjective. For example, to tall, you can add er to create the comparative form taller, and est to create the superlative form tallest. So far, I have called these endings, but from now, I will use the more accurate term, inflections. Anything that can be added to a word, either at the beginning or the end, is called an inflection. As I'm sure you've noticed, however, not all adjectives use inflections to create the two comparative forms. In other words, not all adjectives add er and est to the end, which is called inflectional comparison. Instead, some adjectives use the words more and most to create the comparative and superlative forms. This is called phrasal comparison. For example, the basic form is beautiful, the comparative form is more beautiful, and the superlative form is most beautiful. You certainly cannot say beautifuler and beautifulest. And it also sounds strange to say more tall and most tall. There is a rule about when to use inflectional and phrasal comparison. Can you work out the rule? Pause the video now and continue when ready. The rule is based on the number of syllables of the adjective. All adjectives with one syllable use inflectional comparison, whereas all adjectives with 3 or more syllables use phrasal comparison. Therefore, this raises the issue of adjectives with 2 syllables. What is the rule for these? Pause the video to think about this. In fact, these words are flexible. Some adjectives with 2 syllables use inflectional comparison, and some use phrasal comparison. For example, we say happy, happier, happiest, easy, easier, easiest, pretty, prettier, prettiest, and we say careful, most careful, handsome, more handsome, most handsome, pleasant, more pleasant, most pleasant. As you can see from these examples, adjectives ending in y use inflectional comparison, and all the others use phrasal comparison. Before we move on, there is one more type of comparison. A few English adjectives change their entire form. For example, for the adjective good, the comparative form is better, and the superlative form is best. For the adjective bad, the comparative is worse, and the superlative is worst. For little, the comparative is less, and the superlative is least. And for far, the comparative is further, and the superlative is furthest. Gradability and comparison certainly interact with each other. Firstly, most adjectives are both gradable and comparative, and if an adjective is gradable, then it is very likely to be comparative too. For example, big can be very big and also bigger. There is a reason for this. Both gradability and comparison have the same intention. They show the level of the adjective from the basic level to the highest level. For example, I am a completely happy person and I am the happiest person have a very similar meaning. Therefore, in general, there is a direct connection between gradability and comparison. However, as always, it is not as simple as this, because a few adjectives are gradable but not comparative. This is true even for some very common adjectives, like glad, which is a common synonym of happy. For example, you can say, "He is really glad to meet you," but it is ungrammatical to say, "He is gladder than me to meet you." But if you use happy instead, "He is really happy to meet you," and "He is happier than me to meet you," both sentences sound fine. So, there is no obvious reason why some adjectives are gradable and not comparative. It is certainly not based on the meaning of the adjective, because happy and glad are synonymous. Can you think of more adjectives that are gradable but not comparative? Pause the video while you think about this. For example, if you are eating dinner, you could say, "I am nearly full," but you can't say, "I am fuller than yesterday." Also, if you are doing your homework, you could say, "My essay is nearly complete," but you can't say, "Out of all of the essays in my class, my essay is the most complete." This is because an essay is either complete or incomplete, so an essay cannot be more complete than another student's essay. In case you are wondering, I cannot think of an adjective which can be comparative but not gradable. If you can, then please leave a comment below. And, of course, several adjectives are neither gradable nor comparative. For example, the adjective nationwide, which describes something which exists or happens in all parts of a country. I'm sure you agree that both of these sentences sound strange. KFC is more nationwide than McDonald's. KFC is very nationwide. As I discussed on the previous page, the reason for some adjectives not being gradable nor comparative is because the adjective either already describes the maximum level of something, or because the meaning of the adjective is either 100% or 0%. In this case, nationwide describes the maximum level of something, because it means in all parts of the country. So, something cannot be quite in all parts of the country, or very in all parts of the country. The core meaning of this word is that something exists everywhere, so it cannot exist quite everywhere, nor more everywhere than somewhere else. Nationwide is just one example, as there are many more. Can you think of other adjectives that are neither comparative nor gradable? Pause the video while you think about this. Here are a few more. Something cannot be more dead or quite dead. Something is not quite impossible or most impossible. Someone cannot be quite pregnant or very pregnant. To know which adjectives are neither gradable nor comparative, you can guess, based on the meaning of the word. If its core meaning describes all or nothing, or the most of something, then it cannot be graded nor compared. To summarize this section of the episode, we have just learned that most adjectives can be attributive, predicative, gradable, and comparative. Because these are the core features of adjectives, adjectives that are all of these are called central adjectives. In contrast, adjectives that can't be all of these are called peripheral adjectives. The metaphor here is therefore a circle. The middle of the circle is the most perfect, prototypical type of adjective. And then, as you move away from the center towards the edge of the circle, the adjective becomes less ideal and perfect. That is the logic behind the terms central and peripheral adjective. To check your understanding of the concepts that we've learned in this section, here is an activity. For these 5 adjectives, perform the 4 tests. If the adjective passes all 4 tests, then it is a central adjective, and if it fails at least one, then it is peripheral. Please pause the video while you complete this activity, and continue when you have finished. Here are the answers. We'll start with the only central adjective, large. You can say a large dog. He's large. He's very large. The dog is larger than that dog. So, it is a central adjective. Next, aware. You can't say an aware person. You can say he's aware. You can say he's very aware. And you can say he is more aware than me. So, it is peripheral. Thirdly, dead. You can say a dead dog. You can say he's dead. You can't say he's very dead. You can't say he is more dead than me. Therefore, it is a peripheral adjective. Fourthly, glad. You cannot say a glad person. You can say he's glad. You can say he's very glad. You can't say he is gladder than me. So, it is peripheral. Finally, main. You can say a main road. You can't say it's main. You can't say it's very main. And you can't say it is mainer than that road. So, it is peripheral. As we previously discussed, dead cannot be gradable nor comparative because death is either 100% or 0%. In other words, a person is either dead or alive. There is no in-between. Actually, there is something in between alive and dead, the adjective undead. This word describes something that thankfully only exists in the works of fiction, zombies. You can ignore this though, because dead, alive, or undead are neither gradable nor comparative. Also, some languages are more strict than others with regards to the 100% or 0% nature of dead. For example, in English, the verb to die can be used in the progressive form, which means that the action is happening now and is continuing. For example, you can say, I'm dying. However, in Chinese, die cannot be used in the progressive form. Therefore, the closest translation of I'm dying is I'm going to die. In the next section, we will discuss the punctuation that you should use for adjectives. In the introduction, I said that if several adjectives describe multiple properties of one noun at the same time, then they must be separated by commas. If there are only 2 adjectives, then they can either be separated by the word and or by a comma. If adjectives do this, then they are called co-ordinate adjectives. Here is an example. I arrived on a cold and stormy evening, but left on a bright, sunny morning. In the first clause, the 2 adjectives modify evening, and in the second clause, they modify morning. Because there are 2 adjectives in both clauses, they can either be separated by and, like in the first clause, or a comma, like in the second clause. However, not all adjectives that are next to each other are coordinate adjectives, because not all adjectives that are next to each other describe multiple properties of the noun. Sometimes, if two adjectives are together, then the second adjective is not modifying the noun, it is actually connected to the noun as one complete, integral unit. Therefore, only the first adjective modifies the second adjective and noun together. In this situation, there is no comma between them, and you cannot put and between them. Let's explore an example together. He went to an excellent Chinese restaurant. Chinese is, of course, an adjective, because it gives us information about the type of restaurant. However, the complete unit here is Chinese restaurant. Therefore, excellent modifies the complete integral unit, not only the noun restaurant. To put it simply, the essential unit is not restaurant, it is Chinese restaurant. Therefore, excellent modifies Chinese restaurant as a whole single unit. If this sounds confusing, then you can test whether the adjectives are coordinate or not by putting and in between the adjectives. Remember that you can either have and or a comma between coordinate adjectives. If they are not coordinate, then the sentence will sound strange. Do you agree that he went to an excellent and Chinese restaurant is incorrect? Therefore, these are not coordinate adjectives. Instead, the first adjective modifies the second one and the noun together as one unit. Do you remember that, in Activity 2, we saw the phrase largest private library? The two adjectives, largest and private, both modify library without a comma, because private library is one complete unit. Therefore, largest modifies the entire unit, which is the second adjective together with the noun, not only the noun. We can test this by putting and between the adjectives. It is definitely incorrect to say, Thomas Phillips collected the largest and private library in the world. In the next section, we will discuss one of the ways to classify adjectives. In addition to central and peripheral adjectives, there is another way to put all adjectives into groups. Or in other words, there is another way to classify adjectives. Here, the rule is based on whether the adjective is linked directly and literally to the noun that it describes. Most attributive adjectives are directly and literally linked to the noun. For example, a red car means a car which is red. The phrase I just said, a car which is red, is actually the test of whether the attributive adjective and the noun's meaning are linked. In other words, put the adjective after which or who and is or are to determine whether the direct connection exists. If both phrases make sense, then the adjective and the noun's meanings are directly linked. Here are some more examples. An old man is a man who is old. Difficult questions are questions which are difficult. Round glasses are glasses which are round. All of these are therefore linked to their nouns in a literal, direct way. This test can also be used for postpositive adjectives, which are adjectives that are directly after the noun. For example, something understood by everyone means something which is understood by everyone. The people responsible for the crime means the people who are responsible for the crime. If a direct, literal connection between the meaning of the adjective and the meaning of the noun exists, the adjectives are called inherent adjectives. If a part of something is inherent, then it is a basic or permanent part of that thing which cannot be removed. However, sometimes the adjective does not have a direct, literal connection to the meaning of the noun. Instead, it has a metaphorical connection. These are called non-inherent adjectives. To be clear, an adjective can be both inherent and non-inherent. Which type it is determined by the nature of the connection it has with the noun. It is not the adjective itself. Let's look at some examples. For all of these, we can perform the test of inherentness. The adjectives on the left will pass, whereas those on the right will fail. For example, distant hills are hills which are distant. A complete chapter is a chapter which is complete. A heavy burden is a burden which is heavy. And an old man is a man who is old. In contrast, look at the phrase distant relatives. A distant relative is someone who is slightly related to you, but is not within your nuclear family. In other words, a distant relative might be your sister-in-law's grandmother's half-nephew. When you say a relative who is distant, it no longer means a relative who is not within your nuclear family. Now, distant has its most basic meaning, which is about physical distance. When we say distant relatives, we don't mean relatives who live far away, which is the meaning of relatives who are distant. Therefore, this has failed the test, because the meaning of distant relatives is lost when we transform it into relatives who are distant. Therefore, it is non-inherent. This is true for the others. A complete idiot is not an idiot who is complete, because now complete has its more basic meaning of finished, not the metaphorical meaning. And an old friend is not a friend who is old, it is a person whom has been your friend for a long time. We've now arrived at the anti-penultimate section of this episode, in which we'll talk about yet another way to classify adjectives. I'll begin by repeating something from another episode in this series, the episode about verbs. There are many ways to classify verbs, and one of them is the distinction between stative verbs and dynamic verbs. Before we talk about adjectives, I'll repeat the basic difference between these two types of verbs. Stative verbs refer to states. A state is a situation which is permanent, or at least exists for a long time. For example, some common stative verbs are own, contain, believe, hate, be, love, see, hear, seem, prefer. If you hate something, for example, your negative feeling usually will exist for a long time. It would be strange to hate something now and then love it 1 hour later. Contrasting this type of verb are dynamic verbs, which refer to actions. An action, unlike a state, can easily change or finish. Some common dynamic verbs are eat, drink, go, type, read, write, listen, speak, watch, say, grow, work, sleep, cook, talk. For example, compare these two sentences. I see the TV. I watch the TV. The first sentence is simply the state of being able to see the TV, whereas the second sentence is the act of watching a show on the TV. It is possible to see the TV for a long time, but after a while, you will stop watching the TV and you will go to bed. This is the basic difference between stative and dynamic verbs. Based on this difference, we can put adjectives into two groups, which followed the same principle. Examples of stative adjectives are big, red, small. These describe properties of the noun which are permanent. In contrast, dynamic adjectives are words like brave, silly, careful, because these describe properties of the noun which are active and changeable. Pause the video and think of more stative and dynamic adjectives. Continue when you have finished. Let's look at two rules regarding these types of adjective. Firstly, stative adjectives cannot be used with ing verbs, or more accurately, progressive aspect verbs. For example, you cannot say, he or it is being big, or being red, being small, or being tall. However, dynamic adjectives certainly can be used with progressive aspect verbs. For instance, it sounds fine to say, he is being silly, or he is being careful. The reason for this rule should be obvious. Progressive aspect verbs are used for actions which are currently happening, and which will finish soon. This is thus very appropriate for dynamic adjectives, but not for stative adjectives, which are not actions and which are permanent. The second rule is regarding imperative sentences. These are commands or orders, and always begin with a verb. For example, sit down, go away, be quiet. Stative adjectives cannot be used in this type of sentence, so it sounds strange to tell someone to be big, or be red, be small, or be tall. However, dynamic adjectives can be used in imperative sentences, so you can certainly say to someone, be careful, don't be cruel, be brave. Again, the reason should be obvious. You cannot tell someone to change something which cannot be changed. I cannot say to someone, be tall, because height is a permanent state. But for emotions or actions which can easily change, you can certainly tell someone to change them. In the penultimate section of this episode, we'll look briefly at groups of words that function as adjectives. It is fairly common for groups of words to function together as an adjective to modify a noun. There are two types of this. Firstly, there are adjective phrases which do not contain a verb. Secondly, there are adjective clauses which do contain a verb. As you will see in the following examples, the adjective phrase can either be before or after the noun. Let's look at some examples of adjective phrases first. The film was not very exciting. This episode is getting more and more boring. I really wanted to paint it sky blue. That area has quite small but cheap houses. The extremely tired dog fell asleep. Please pause the video and answer the question on the screen. Which adjectives are attributive, predicative, and postpositive? As you can see, the adjective phrase can either be before or after the noun. D and E are attributive adjectives, A and B are predicative adjectives, whereas C is a postpositive adjective. Adjective clause is another name for relative clause. Relative clauses modify a noun and always begin with a relative pronoun. These are who, whom, whose, that, which, when, where, and why. After the relative pronoun, there is always a verb. It makes sense that relative clauses modify nouns because this is also the function of adjectives. Relative clauses are sometimes separated from the rest of the sentence with commas, but sometimes they are not. Regarding their position in the sentence, if the relative clause modifies the subject of the sentence, then it is in the middle of the sentence. If the relative clause modifies the object of the sentence, then it is at the end of the sentence. Let's now see some examples. Cake, which many people love, is not very healthy. The students whose names are on the list passed the exam. I still remember the days when there was no internet. My favourite author is Richard Dawkins, whose latest book was excellent. The shop where the masks were being sold had a huge line of people outside. As you can see, sometimes the relative clause is separated from the rest of the sentence with commas, and sometimes it is not. Also, if the relative clause modifies the subject of the sentence, the relative clause is in the middle of the sentence. And if it modifies the object, then it is at the end. If you want to learn the reasons why, or if you simply want to learn more about them, then there is another episode in this series about relative clauses. An adjective clause can easily be reduced to an adjective phrase. There are two ways to do this. Depending on the grammar of the sentence, you can either delete the relative pronoun and the verb, or delete the relative pronoun and turn the verb into an ing verb. Specifically, use the first method if the adjective clause modifies the object of the main clause, and use the second method if the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause. Here are some examples. Firstly, I need a person who is smarter than me to fix my computer becomes, I need a person smarter than me to fix my computer. Secondly, the charity is raising money for cats who need homes becomes, the charity is raising money for cats needing homes. We've now arrived at the final section of this episode. As we have seen throughout this episode, it is common to put 2 or 3 adjectives together to describe multiple properties of one noun. When we do this, you should not randomly put them together, because there is actually a rule about the order of the adjectives. Here is the order for the most common properties of adjectives: quantity, opinion, size, temperature, age, shape, color, material, origin, purpose. Of course, we very rarely put 10 properties together to describe one noun, but if we did, then this is the correct order. Changing this order will sound strange. Here is an example. She had 3 beautiful, big, cold, old, square, blue, cotton, British sports bags. For you and me, this sounds very complicated. When I first learned about this order, I was surprised, because I had never thought about it before. Native English speakers use this order instinctively, so they don't need to learn and memorize it. Sadly, however, non-native speakers do need to learn this order, because if you change the order of the adjectives, it sounds incorrect. Even though it's very rare to put 10 adjectives together, you must still use this order when putting 2 or 3 adjectives together. Here are some examples to demonstrate this. Which sounds better? A tiny purple horse or a purple tiny horse? I hope you said the first one, because tiny is size and purple is color, and size is before color in the order. Next, a cold leather bag or a leather cold bag. The first one sounds better because cold is temperature and leather is material. Finally, a Chinese scary dragon or a scary Chinese dragon. The second sounds better because scary is an opinion and Chinese is origin. Well done if you knew the answers without needing to check the order, because that means you have already instinctively learned this order, so you don't need to consciously think about it when putting adjectives together. We'll finish with an activity. Put the adjectives in this sentence into the correct order. I want to buy rectangle, stylish, Chinese, all-purpose, hand-sized, brand new, black, warm, metal, one, phone. To help you, here is the order. Please pause the video now to complete the activity. Okay, here is the answer. I want to buy one stylish, hand-sized, warm, brand new, rectangle, black, metal, Chinese, all-purpose phone. Well done if you got it right. This is the end of the video about adjectives. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my English grammar series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.